You know, there's this iconic image we all have in our heads, the perfect, polished, endlessly charming Hollywood. We picture Johnny Carson and Dean Martin, these titans of late night and the Rat Pack, exchanging these warm smiles for the cameras, two kings on their thrones, right? They seemed like the best of pals, all mutual respect and camaraderie. But you have to understand, behind that flawlessly crafted television facade, there was one of entertainment's most profound and surprising feuds. This wasn't some minor dust-up. It was a deep, genuine animosity that Carson harbored toward Dean Martin for decades. It's a jaw-dropping realization. The king of late night, famous for his effortless geniality, utterly despised one of America's most beloved entertainers. And today, we're actually going to pull back that curtain not just on a rivalry, but on a clash of values so fundamental it reveals the very core of what made each man a legend. We're revealing why Carson eventually issued one of his rare, unspoken but permanent bans from The Tonight Show. The truth here isn't just a fun piece of gossip. It's a look at the two radically different ways these giants approached the craft of entertainment, and why Carson, the precisionist, simply couldn't forgive what he saw as Martin's cardinal sins against television itself. To really get why Carson felt this way, you have to understand how utterly different these men were. Carson built his entire empire on meticulous preparation, split-second timing, and a relentless work ethic. The Tonight Show wasn't just a job. It was a finely tuned machine, an art form that demanded serious dedication. Dean Martin, on the other hand, cultivated an aura of effortlessness. He was the ultimate cool guy, captivating millions without ever seeming to break a sweat, and crucially, his apparent indifference to preparation was central to his appeal. It was casual brilliance versus controlled, engineered brilliance. When those two philosophies slammed together on the most important stage in late night, the result was a simmering resentment that the cameras never captured, but that those behind the scenes watched unfold. Let's talk about the specific cracks that formed the chasm between them. The number one reason, the one that truly drove Carson to distraction, was this feeling that Dean Martin simply didn't respect the stage. For Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show was the absolute pinnacle of television craft. A world where timing, professionalism, and preparation created this beautiful, seamless illusion. Everything mattered. Dean Martin represented the total opposite of this philosophy. He embraced unpredictability, but what truly infuriated Carson was Martin's habit of arriving and performing in various states of intoxication, or at least a very convincing imitation of it. Think about it. During the 60s and 70s, Martin would project that famous persona, slurring his words just enough, occasionally losing his train of thought, treating the whole high-stakes interview like an impromptu chat at a cocktail party. Now, the audience at home found that charming, that relaxed, unfiltered vibe. Carson, however, saw it as a profound disrespect to the craft. Insiders say Carson would keep his professional mask on during the interviews, but the moment the cameras were off, his frustration was palpable. As one longtime Tonight Show writer put it, Johnny valued precision in comedy above almost everything else. He believed that making something difficult look easy required incredible discipline. Dean's whole act was pretending that discipline didn't matter at all. It drove Johnny crazy. The breaking point appears to have come during a 1976 appearance. Staffers present that night claim Martin seemed to cross a line from his usual tipsy character into genuine impairment. He was reportedly losing his place mid-anecdote, laughing at things that weren't jokes, and at one point seemed momentarily disoriented. Carson held it together on air, but backstage he reportedly delivered the final verdict to his producer. "I don't care if it's an act. If you can't finish a sentence, you're not doing comedy. You're killing airtime." That quote is everything. For Carson, comedy was a precision craft, a perfect performance. For Martin, it was an attitude, a vibe, something that didn't need to follow the rules. This is when the invitations started drying up. It wasn't an official decree, but it was the start of Martin's long, slow fade from the stage he once owned. This is especially telling because Carson was famously tolerant of other stars with drinking issues, but Martin committed the unforgivable sin, using alcohol, real or pretended, as a substitute for preparation. And that brings us to the second massive point of contention. Dean never took the interview seriously. Beyond the apparent intoxication, the real core irritation was Martin's approach to the very essence of a talk show: the conversation. Carson's genius lay in his interviewing skill. He could guide a conversation, react in the moment, and make guests look incredible. He took this craft seriously, reviewing research, preparing threads, viewing the segment as a collaborative performance with clear roles. Martin, again, brought that casual indifference. Multiple producers confirmed that Martin rarely bothered with any pre-show discussions, often just strolling in moments before his segment. Once on air, he would commit all of Carson's pet peeves: one-word answers to carefully crafted questions, interrupting setups, and worst of all, simply ignoring a question entirely to launch into an unrelated anecdote. Johnny hated guests who made the host do all the work, and Dean was the worst offender, a former talent coordinator recalled. Most guests understood that their job was to meet the host halfway in creating good television. Dean acted like he was doing Johnny a favor just by showing up. There's a famous 1974 appearance where Carson tried to ask about a Frank Sinatra guest spot on Martin's variety show. Instead of answering, Dean just smiled vaguely and started talking about a golf tournament. The camera briefly caught Carson's face, a flicker of genuine annoyance before the mask snapped back into place. For Carson, this behavior wasn't just personal disrespect. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the talk show format. By treating his appearance as an unimportant afterthought, Martin was communicating that he didn't value the television form Carson had spent his entire life perfecting and elevating. It's a contrast that tells you everything you need to know about the two sides of show business: the performer who prepares and the performer who relies solely on charisma. And that comparison you just mentioned, between Martin's nonchalance and the professional rigor of people like Jack Benny or James Stewart, that difference wasn't just noted by the staff, it cut Carson to the core. For him, Martin's casual attitude wasn't authentic. It was borderline unprofessional, a silent insult to the medium he'd mastered. This leads us right into the third, massive reason for the animosity. Carson deeply resented the Rat Pack swagger. The entertainment world of the 1960s had these two radically different male identities. You had the Rat Pack, Sinatra, Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., this crew that embodied a very specific aggressive coolness built on insider jokes, exclusivity, and a certain kind of entitled swagger. They acted like Hollywood royalty who made their own rules. Then you had Carson, equally successful, but representing a more measured Midwestern sensibility. He valued wit over swagger, hard work over inherent privilege. This was a clash of philosophies about what celebrity actually meant. The Rat Pack operated as if the world should accommodate their whims. Carson, despite his colossal success, maintained the perspective of a meticulous professional who earned every ounce of his position through talent and craft, not through birthright. According to NBC executives, Carson found the Rat Pack's sense of entitlement deeply off-putting, viewing it as a relic of an older, arrogant Hollywood. One longtime NBC executive summed up the tension: Johnny wasn't part of the Rat Pack, and he despised their arrogant insider club attitude. Dean's vibe was always, "You're lucky to have me." Johnny's response, though he'd never say it publicly, was essentially, "Don't bother showing up next time." This divide wasn't just philosophical. It showed up in how they treated people. Carson, for all his privacy, was known for treating every single stagehand, photographer, and production assistant with consistent respect, learning their names and acknowledging their value. Martin, following the Rat Pack code, often brought a hierarchical view to the set. Staff accounts recall him rarely learning crew names and sometimes conducting himself with the expectation that normal workplace rules simply didn't apply to a star of his magnitude. As the 70s progressed and Carson himself started evolving The Tonight Show toward more thoughtful content and diverse guests, Martin's unchanging Rat Pack persona began to feel incredibly anachronistic and out of place in Carson's carefully defined framework. The divide was now unbridgeable. One star expected collaboration and earned respect. The other expected deference and accommodation. Now, every rivalry has a flashpoint. a moment that turns slow burn into open resentment. And that takes us to point number 4. Dean upstaged him while wasted. The moment occurred at a 1975 NBC roast honoring a network executive. Carson, the network's undisputed king, was the master of ceremonies. He did what he always did. He prepared meticulously, crafting a series of sharp, tailored jokes. Martin was given a brief segment in the middle. He arrived visibly intoxicated, not the usual Dean Martin character, but genuinely impaired. Executives considered pulling him, but decided against the headache it would cause. What happened next is legendary among NBC insiders. Despite his condition, Martin delivered what many described as the most hilarious performance of the night. Seemingly without effort, he riffed extemporaneously for nearly double his allotted time, generating continuous, spontaneous laughter. Carson, who had spent days preparing, was left in the uncomfortable position of following a spontaneous triumph. His carefully crafted jokes, while professional, seemed stiff next to Martin's explosive, freewheeling performance. Backstage, Carson was reportedly furious. One executive recalled him calling Dean a lazy drunk with better writers. That comment reveals the deepest part of Carson's wound. The suspicion that Martin's apparent spontaneity was a lie, masking uncredited preparation by others, creating an illusion of effortlessness that Carson found dishonest. This incident undercut Carson's entire philosophy. It publicly rewarded the exact unprofessional behavior Carson despised, showing up intoxicated, and worse, it gave the unfair perception that Martin's natural talent somehow surpassed Carson's disciplined, crafted approach. At that roast, Carson lost control of the room, and he was forced to compete directly with Martin on equal footing. This moment solidified his reluctance, which soon became total exclusion, to ever book Martin again. And that brings us to the 5th and most fundamental point. Carson couldn't stand the phony persona. The core of Carson's animosity wasn't a moral objection to drinking, but a professional objection to inauthenticity in performance. Martin's persona was built on being the carefree drinker who always had a glass in hand, which often, in reality, contained apple juice instead of booze. The 5th and perhaps most profound point of contention was this. Carson couldn't stand the phony persona. You see, the lovable drunk became Martin's trademark, so much so that audiences demanded it whether he was genuinely impaired or stone-cold sober. And often he was sober, maintaining the character while the glass in his hand contained apple juice. Carson, by contrast, had a different kind of authenticity. The Johnny you saw on The Tonight Show, the dry wit, the emotional restraint, the Nebraskan directness, that was all an extension of the private man just honed for television. Martin's entire career, in Carson's view, was predicated on an elaborately constructed character that had little relationship to the man himself. One staffer claimed Johnny told him, "If you're going to drink, drink. But don't lie to people about who you are." On my stage, that's the key. Carson could handle genuine demons, which is why he maintained warm relationships with stars like Richard Burton, who were honest about their struggles. Martin, however, had constructed a deception, a performance of impairment that, as the 70s wore on, seemed to mock the struggles of people with actual alcohol issues, while allowing Martin to avoid the professional consequences of real impairment. For Carson, this made Martin fundamentally dishonest. It was an insult to the audience and to the craft. He famously disliked guests who showed up with pre-prepared anecdotes passed off as spontaneous recollections. Martin was the extreme of this, a performer whose entire public identity was a carefully maintained fiction. As the 70s turned into the 80s, audiences were increasingly valuing authenticity, and Carson was evolving with that shift. Martin, stubbornly clinging to that older model of stardom built on illusion, became, in Carson's eyes, a relic of a less honest entertainment era. Their philosophical disagreement over the proper relationship between a performer and the audience was now an unbridgeable gulf, which brings us to the ultimate, final, and devastating act, point number 6. Dean blew off an invite, and Carson never forgot. All the professional slights, the casual disrespect, the Rat Pack swagger, the fake drinking. They all culminated in an event that turned professional frustration into deep, personal animosity. In 1981, NBC was planning a massive special to celebrate Carson's 20th anniversary as host. This was a celebration of television history, and despite all their differences, Carson personally included Martin on the list of desired participants, suggesting him for a segment reuniting early Tonight Show legends. This was an immense olive branch, an opportunity to set aside the tension and celebrate the medium they both shaped. Martin's representatives initially accepted, even blocking the date on his calendar. But just 2 weeks before the taping, his team informed NBC that he would not be appearing, offering no explanation. Carson allegedly invited Dean to co-host a major special in the early 80s. Dean declined without explanation, confirmed one senior NBC executive. Johnny never spoke to him again. He banned him from The Tonight Show permanently. For Carson, the unexplained rejection crossed a line from professional disagreement into personal disrespect. Carson was a man who compartmentalized. He could dislike a person privately, but still book them professionally if they were a major star. Martin's unexplained withdrawal shattered that distinction. It transformed him from a professionally frustrating guest into a betrayer who delivered a deep personal slight. The timing, just weeks before taping, forced producers to scramble and reconfigure major segments. The inconvenience mixed with the perceived personal rejection created the perfect storm for Carson's legendary capacity to hold a grudge. Martin's name was added to a very short list of permanently banned celebrities. This wasn't a temporary timeout. It was a complete and utter exclusion that lasted for the remainder of Carson's tenure. More than a decade of complete absence from television's most important platform, the permanent. Banishment had real professional consequences for Martin as his career aged, cutting him off from the essential exposure only Carson's show could provide. This final chapter reveals the essence of Carson's character. Beneath the genial public persona was a man who placed an enormous, non-negotiable value on loyalty, respect, and professional courtesy. When Dean Martin violated those core principles, he discovered the limits of Carson's tolerance, transforming instantly from an occasional guest into a permanent outsider in television's most important kingdom. The fascinating thing is that this entire feud wasn't about two stars battling for the spotlight. It was about two competing visions for the soul of show business. The precise craftsman who demanded honesty versus the effortlessly cool charmer who built an empire on a glorious illusion.